Also would like to welcome those joining online on our webpage or on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Today we're here to discover the key findings of a report written jointly by MENA Rights Group and the Emirates Detainees Advocacy Centre. Ahead of the review of the United Arab Emirates by the UN Committee Against Torture, MENA Rights Group aims to shed light on the systematic practice of torture in the UAE. So to speak about the report, we have on the panel 4 distinguished speakers, and we will also have 2 persons joining by recorded video. And today's event will be moderated by Giulia Zomignani Barbosa, who is a legal consultant at the MENA Rights Group. Giulia, you have the floor. Thank you very much.
Is this working? Okay.
Speak in the microphone, close to the microphone, so everybody hears you.
Okay. Oh.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm not used to microphones. But yeah, well, thank you for the introduction. Welcome everyone. Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us, whichever method you're using to join us. So, as was just mentioned, we're holding this week the implementation of the UN Convention Against Torture by the United Arab Emirates, or the UAE. And as was also just mentioned, we at MENA Rights Group, together with the Emirates Detainees Advocacy Centre, submitted a report to the committee to provide them with information about our findings about the practices of torture in the UAE. So today I'll be presenting the main findings from that report, but we're also going to hear from other organizations as well as the individual testimonies of victims of torture. So you're not just going to hear from me, but you're also going to be hearing from Hamad al-Shamsi, the director of the Emirates Detainees Advocacy Centre, from Dr. Matthew Hedges and Ali Ahmed, both British citizens who were victims of torture themselves. We're also going to hear from Janan Al Marzooqi, a human rights defender and the daughter of prisoner of conscience Abdulsalam Al Marzooqi, and Naji Hamdan, the director of the Association of Victims of Torture in the UAE, and also a torture survivor himself. And at the end, after everyone speaks, we'll have some time for Q&A, and you can put your questions through different methods, through Zoom or here in the room. But I'll start with the findings, or the main findings of the report. So our report was based on a legal analysis of the UAE legislation, but also on the cases that were documented by MENA Rights Groups and the Emirates Detainee Advocacy Centre of human rights violations in the UAE. So one of our first findings was that when we look at the legal framework in the UAE, there are not sufficient guarantees to prevent the practice of torture. So for example, people who are arrested do not have access to a lawyer from the moment of arrest, because the legislation only foresees that you will have access to a lawyer during trial, so not during pre-trial detention. There's also no guarantee that you will have access to a lawyer for free if you cannot afford it, unless it's a case of death penalty or life imprisonment. And even for those who have a lawyer, for you to be able to see your lawyer from a detention center, you need previous written authorization from the public prosecution office. And on top of that, all the meetings between a detainee and a lawyer have to be held within sight, but without the hearing of an officer of the detention place, which severely limits people's access to a lawyer, as well as the right to meet with their lawyer privately. And legal guarantees are even more scarce when we're talking about cases involving either terrorism or state security. This is particularly concerning in the UAE because this crimes that relate to terrorism or state security, they're defined in overly broad, ambiguous, and basically it's kind of a catch-all wording, which means that anyone who expresses any form of peaceful dissent can be prosecuted for terrorism or for an offense against state security. Another concerning thing about this type of offenses is that they fall under the investigative mandate of the state security apparatus, or the SSA. They're an institution that has wide powers and that respond solely to the president of the UAE, There's no oversight mechanism to oversee the work. And one of the wide powers that they have is that the president of the SSA can order the detention of accused persons for up to 90 days before they're presented to the public prosecutor. This means that they can be detained for 3 months with no judicial supervision. And then in practice, in the cases that were documented by MENA Rights Groups and the Emirates Detainees Advocacy Centre, we have noted a pattern of widespread human rights violations that are committed by the SSA. So most of these violations are committed against human rights defenders or members of political oppositions or people who express dissent, even if it's in a peaceful way. Should I change? Okay. And the way that the SSA usually operates is that they will arrest people without showing a warrant, then they'll take them to an undisclosed place of detention where they're kept incommunicado, sometimes for weeks, sometimes for months, in extreme cases for even over a year. During this period, they're often subjected to torture and ill-treatment, frequently with the aim of extracting confessions for crimes that they did not commit. And even though the Emirati legislation foresees that any type of evidence obtained under torture will not be accepted in court, in practice this prohibition is not applied, and coerced confessions are often at the base of convictions. And even after someone is convicted, the detention conditions are really poor, so sometimes these people continue to be subjected to treatment, and access to medical care is often denied so that they cannot receive care for the consequences of the treatment that they're subjected to. And in some cases, well, in terrorism cases, even after someone completes their sentence, they may still remain in detention because extra time in detention may be ordered for so-called counseling reasons, and there are very limited ways to challenge this. So arbitrary detention can continue even beyond the initial time of the sentence. It's also important to stress that the crimes that are investigated by the SSA are prosecuted before the Abu Dhabi Federal Court of Appeal, and the decisions can only be appealed to the State Security Chamber of the Federal Supreme Court. But the judges of both these courts are appointed by the executive bodies, and so are the members of the public prosecution. And again, the SSA is also under the control of the executive, which means that the executive just have an overarching power. And so there are very little chances that the atrocities committed by the SSA will be prosecuted. On top of that, some of the violations even spread beyond the UAE's borders. So, for example, in the context of the armed conflict in Yemen, the UAE initially joined the Saudi-led coalition that was fighting the Houthis since the beginning of the conflict in 2015. And the UAE and the local groups that supported were responsible for several secret detention facilities where torture and other human rights violations were constantly committed. In 2019, the UAE announced that it was withdrawing its troops from Yemen, yet it is still believed that the UAE has great influence over the Saudi coalition and the local groups that it supports. So these were the main findings of our report. The report is also available on MENA Rights website if you want to look at things in more detail. But with this, I will give the floor to Hamad al-Shamsi, the director of the Emirates Detainees Advocacy Centre, who has recorded his intervention.
Hi, my name is Ahmed al-Shamsi. I am from the Emirates Detainees Advocacy Centre. In the center, we have documented the cases of more than 70 prisoners of conscience. And we concluded that every prisoner of conscience in the Emirates is arrested according to the state security law issued in 2003. The law gives the State Security Service the right to detain people in facilities nobody knows their whereabouts. These facilities are run by the State Security Services themselves. These facilities, not even the detainees knows their whereabouts. When the prisoners of conscience get out of these prisons, they do not know where they have been kept, not even the lawyers, not even their families. And while in the detention, the prisoners of conscience being interrogated, And while interrogation, they are subjected to many different methods of torture: psychological torture and physical torture. I'm talking here about physical torture. They are being beaten in prison. They are kept incommunicado for a year, solitary confinement. Some people kept under continuous interrogation for weeks. When I'm talking about continuous interrogation, I'm talking about 24 hours of interrogation, like 3 sessions a day. They can get rest between one session and the other session, like 30 minutes, but this continue for a week. Under intense lighting, people in such facility, they do not have access to their lawyers. They do not have access to their families. Their families do not know their whereabouts. And when their families would like to make sure that their member, the detainees, is still alive, they contacted the public prosecution office and they said, we do not know their location. And the prisoners of conscience in such facility he's allowed to call his family like twice a month, sometimes once a month, just to tell his family that he's still alive. I will give you an example here of one of the prisoners of conscience. His name is Ahmed al-Zahabi. He was detained in 26th of March 2012. He kept incommunicado in such facility until 9th of March 2013, almost a year. A year incommunicado, solitary confinement. Nobody knows his whereabouts. And when he was in such a prison, he was beaten. And 5 months later, when he was transferred to the public prosecution office for official interrogation, the public prosecution office noticed traces of torture on his body. And just imagine, 5 months later, and the traces of torture still appear on his body. Ahmed al-Zahabi is not alone. It is not an isolated case. Every prisoner of conscience in the UAE has to go through the same process. It became part of the system. It is systematic torture. Another example, Amina al-Abduli. Amina al-Abduli, mother of 5. When she got out of the state security facility prison, and she was transferred to Al-Wathba prison, she sent us a recording. We published part of it. In the recording, she explained in detail what happened to her when she was in state security facility prisons. She was beaten on her eye. The traces appeared on her eye. She was threatened to deprive custody on her 5 children, and many other types of methods of torture. Another example, Ali Abdul Noor. Maybe some of you heard about Ali Abdul Noor because it was a famous case. Ali Abdul Noor was diagnosed with cancer when she was in prison. And unfortunately, the UAE government deprived her right to adequate treatment. Ali Abdul Noor passed away in the prison in 2019, even though many human rights organizations in the world, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, the UN, called upon the UAE government to release Ali Abdul Noor just to give her the right to die, to pass away, while she was like between her family. But even though she was deprived from that right. This is, as I mentioned, is not an isolated cases. They are not isolated cases. They are not alone. Every prisoner of conscience has to go through the same process. It is part of the system. It is systematic torture. And what we hope from you is to call upon the government of UAE to release the prisoners of conscience and to help us close these prisons, these secret prisons. Because we know for a fact, as long as we have secret prisons, torture will continue. And torture will not stop as long as we have secret prisons in the UAE. So let's call upon the UAE government to close these facilities. Thank you very much.
We're now going to hear from Matthew Hedges.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for coming and listening to us and hearing our statements, our evidence of experience of torture within the UAE. I'm going to echo, and I'm going to also extend some of the comments already made and those that will be delivered by some other people. I was a victim of torture in the UAE where, as Hamad just said, and has been said by Julia, held in prolonged solitary confinement for nearly 7 months. At the start, the state security officers who I was taken by threatened to keep me beyond the knowledge and the reach of my family for a year. They explicitly stated that they could hold me for 12 months before they can take me to court. Until then, I am at their whim. I'm at their mercy. In another occasion, after threatening my personal physical safety, they threatened to take me, to rendition me to an overseas military base in Yemen. Again, this is something which will come up later, but it's very well evidenced and documented about some of the activities of the UAE within Yemen. The torture and abuse that happened to me, as has been said, in many cases is completely systematic, both on an individual level, but also as part of a much wider system. This comes from the physical beatings which they refrained from with me because they felt as though I was working with them in the interrogations. But in other rooms, I could hear the beatings. I could see the evidence of blood, of marks on the walls. I saw people being carried out of rooms by multiple soldiers. And for one of 2 nights when I wasn't held in solitary confinement, I listened to evidence and testimonies from 2 specific examples which really stand out. One, a gentleman had returned, he said, from Syria, and he was tied to a chair with a bag on his head for a year. He had made friends with a rat, that's what he said, because this was the only thing that was living, that he had any communication with. And that solitary confinement is designed deliberately to test your physical will, your strength. And he clearly wasn't very well afterwards. In other cases, there were a group of Afghan men who weren't able to stand because they'd been forced to stand for 24 hours a day for over a week. This meant that all the blood they had congealed, their bodies were swollen to an extent that they were in such physical agony, but this wasn't something that was kinetically done to them, but part of a stress procedure designed deliberately to test the strength of the individual. So on the one hand, of course, there is the brutal nature which has been learnt, which has been also taught to the UAE and in particular to the State Security Department, but they've evolved to understand that with physical torture, with physical beatings, there's also a degree of evidence that comes alongside it. And so the psychological aspect and the other mechanisms with which they can leverage were, at least in my case, predominant. They gave me medication. They forced me to take medication that was both like an upper, something such as Ritalin, Adderall, and then mix this with antidepressant medication, sleeping medication, and when used in 17-hour interrogations for multiple days in a week, for months on end, of course this is it's a deliberate tool in their kit for investigations. But this really was, and I'm absolutely the first person to admit it, I'm extremely lucky to be here. And to be able to speak and to give evidence at the UN, to have the legal support to follow those cases when I know there are hundreds, if not thousands of people who, they don't have that same support. Even the UAE, as Julia said, they offer you a lawyer, if you are on a case for a death sentence or a life sentence. yes, the State Security Court offered me a lawyer nearly 6 months into my detention, and I saw the lawyer for 5 minutes the day before my defense hearing. This was, this runs contrary to the support that the British Embassy gave, where one of the lawyers that they suggested had in a previous case been both the prosecutor and the defending lawyer. So when you look at the legal system to which the state security operates in, this clearly is a fallacy. It is like a paper tiger designed to suit their own needs. But if I was to take this further and give you the strongest example that justice, if torture is to be analyzed and investigated seriously within the UAE, the justice system sits really at the heart of this. And the case of Sheikh Isa bin Zayed, the video evidence that appeared of him running over an Afghan national, shooting bullets at him, electrocuting him, whipping him, beating him, on evidence, on video, it's unequivocal proof. He was acquitted of this punishment within an Abu Dhabi court. So if you can be filmed doing this behavior and you meet no punishment for it, how can there be any acknowledgement, how can there be any defense for the system of abuse which has developed within the UAE? It's then important for us to be here, to be giving evidence to the UN on a personal level, but also one to help illustrate the systemic nature of these systems of abuses within the UAE. This is not just something that is a random occurrence and that is a mistake. No, this is something that is part of the it's part of the DNA of that structure designed to keep power concentrated and to reduce the ability of individuals any freedom or protection. And that's really why we're happy for you all to be here, for you all to listen to us, and hopefully this can then be understood, this can be taken by the Committee Against Torture to acknowledge and to understand, to attribute that these abuses are state mandated, that they are not just legitimized, they are enforced by the state. This is not, this is not a degree of liberal freedom that someone has. No, this is a deliberate part of the strategy designed to seek their aims and goals. And for that, hopefully, a sanction of some degree will come in the appropriate manner. And thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Matthew, for sharing your story with us. And yes, I'll give the floor to Ali Ahmed now.
Thank you very much for your coming, and thank you very much for the panel. And thank you very much for MENA Rights Group to organize this event. So basically, my name is Ali Ahmed. I'm from UK. So I'm gonna give you just briefly about my story in United Arab Emirates. I'm a former detained in Emirates. What's happened to me in the UAE, it was very dramatic, it's important for you to know the truth of UAE. So basically, in January 2019, I traveled to UK for holiday and watching Asian Cup. At that time, it's hosted in UAE. And after one of the match, I attended few matches. One match, last match I attended, which was between Qatar and Iraq. After the match, I was pushed around by security. I have been told to take off the T-shirt, and they were very aggressive. There was basically they're all in traditional clothes, so they present themselves as a tahariyat, like state security. And yeah, and I was made to back to Dubai, which I based. And next day, I was driving around, went to the beach, having a nice time. And the way back to my hotel, I've been stopped from the intelligence. And, you know, it was unbelievable. They asked me to come off the car. I was handcuffed and then put me on the back of the car. They put a plastic bag over my head. And they start searching the cars, and you know, it was two people. They was wearing civilian clothes as well. And what's happened after? Yeah, I was wearing a T-shirt. The flag, Qatarian flag, was on the side. One of the guys, he took the knife pocket. He started cutting the flag into my chest, into my body. And he was shouting and screaming and saying, "This flag, you cannot raise it in here." You know, it was very tough time. I got punched, lost one of my teeth. I was bleeding. And then the ambulance came. They kept me inside the ambulance over 2 hours. And then they took me to the hospital. They treated my wound. They bandaged it. And then they took me to the special detain. I detained there. I've been interrogated days and nights. I wasn't allowed to eat or sleep or drink even. I wasn't allowed to contact anyone. I was interrogated for days and nights. I was electrocuted as well. And it was very tough time for me, you know. It's very hard to relive everything, but I will try to describe briefly. And one of the days, senior guy, he came from Abu Dhabi. He said he came from me, and he said only way to get out from here to make the confession, which is self-inflicted, my injury or whatever. And then they took me to the state security prosecutor. So they didn't allow me to go see him in person. One of the guys entered the office, stayed for 10 minutes, and then he came and he looked at me and asked me what's my name, and they took me from there to the hospital to make like a report. They took me back to special detain. I was detained there. I was interrogated for all the time. So too many questions and too many people. So random people just come in and interrogate me all the time. So I reached the time even I can't sleep or I don't have that power because you know, lose too much energy and blood and I didn't drink or eat for days. And after that, they brought me some water, and then they just allowed me to 1 cup of water. They kept me there until they said only way to get off from that place, I have to sign for a document. I don't know which is it. And I was threatened. If I didn't sign, I could save life in prison to be drug related, you know. The senior guy, he was telling, you know, we are the government here, we can't do anything. And even he said, it's for us to very easy when you go out and have a car accident and you will die for the car accident. And we are the government, no one top of us. It was very serious. And then they made me to sign some documents. So when they get the document, finally they transformed to normal police station. So there I was able to make a 1 call from my friend in London. So I wasn't allowed to contact anyone until that stage. My friend, he talked to the Foreign Office, and then Foreign Office talked to the British Embassy. And then my stories come out. I didn't know anything. A few days later, I received a call from British Embassy. And I asked them to come to the prison. I need to see them in privacy. And the presenter from British Embassy, she came to the prison. They called me to the office with the officers. And I was asked I need to speak to her in privacy. They didn't allow me to do that. And then I refused to talk in front of them, and I said to him, that's my right, I have to speak to you on privacy. And then they said, only way to speak privacy, so we have to go to the visitor phone. So, yeah. And then she started the other side for the visitor side, and I stayed the other side, prisoner side. And then I said to her, still, this is not privacy. I need you to talk to her on privacy. This is very serious. And then she says, okay, just talk, whatever. They're not allowed to us to have a privacy. And then I start tell her about my story. And a few minutes, they cut the phones, and then they said, that's it, your time is finished. They took me back to the prison. I spent there a few days. And then one of the days, I got a phone call from British Embassy. They said, I will have a hearing court soon. It's going to be a few days' time. The night before the hearing court, I've been stabbed inside the prison. I was very lucky to survive. I've been stabbed in my stomach, and then I've been taken to the hospital, and then they ditched my womb, and they bring me back. I was asked them to have a safe place or whatever. They say to me, and just I'm a prisoner, so I don't have any rights. And they kept me in the same place. Spent the next day, they took me to the judge, and then the judge said, I've been accused to wasting police time. I said to the judge, that's not all right. So he said, if you want to finish it and go home, or you want to go back to your place. I said to him, definitely, I want to go home. So he said, okay, 1,500 dirham fines, and you're free to go. I was shocked, and then the officer took me back. They bring me back to the prison, and they didn't release me at that time, and they kept me until midnight. They came over, they called my name, and I went to the office. They tell me to sign some document, releasing document. I've signed everything. And then they said to me, I'm free to go. And they didn't give me anything like my passport or bank card, my cards or everything. They said to me, you're free to go. I said to him, so I need my stuff. They said, you can't have it now. You will come back morning to have it. I said to him, I just come for holiday. I don't know anything in this country. And why do you want me to go out in this time, in the middle of the night? I refused to go out. They forced me. I refused again. They tried for a couple of times, and then forcefully they kicked me out without anything. No money, no documents, no bank card. So, for me, it's a flashback, because why they kicked me out in this time. So I was thinking to maybe they trying to have a revenge or whatever, because my story, it was on the news. And I didn't know that my story, it was on the news even. I hid somewhere around there. And in the morning I came back. The officer was very angry. He said, where are you? I said to him, somewhere. He said, when you left, said the guy have a key safe. He came, we trying to look for you. We couldn't find you. I said to him, that's not the case now. I need my stuff. So they gave me my passport and bank card, everything, my money and wallet. And I flew back from Dubai to Birmingham. This was my story, because of political situation dispute between Qatar and UAE. And that time in special detain, they was said to me, if I have any sympathy with Qatar, I could save 15 years in prison and $1,100 fine. And they said there's a law, so you have shown the sympathy to Qatar. So it's not allowed to raise any flag of Qatar or sympathy to Qatar in UAE at that time because of disputes between Qatar and UAE. And this is the real of UAE. I left that moment in UAE, so that's why it's important to to UN to look at carefully and think about its human rights violation in UAE. Things is happening is real. It's not just propaganda. You know, we are the victims, so we've been through this whole situation. So even me, I never thought is, you know, when you hear it in the past, Dubai is, they promote themselves as a tourist place. So almost everyone want to go to see Dubai and have a nice time. Even for me, you know, I was on holiday, so I went to Dubai to have a nice time. And unfortunately, it was very tough time for me, and I'm very lucky to survive to tell you my story. And thank you once again for coming, for all your support. And thank you for Julia, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much for sharing your story with us. And we'll now hear the testimony of Janan Al Marzooqi that she recorded for us.
Hello, everyone. First, I'd like to thank you for organizing this conference and creating this opportunity to shed light on victims of torture and human rights violations in the UAE. I'll start by introducing myself. I am Janan Abdulsalam Al Marzooqi. People tend to call me a human rights defender. But first and foremost, I am the daughter of a great man, a man who paid a heavy price for expressing his opinion and peacefully demanding democratic reform. People know my father, Abdulsalam Darwish, as the counselor and director of the Family Conciliation and Guidance Department at Dubai Courts. What they don't know is that he was also the first one to introduce this department to Dubai Courts, which then was replicated by other courts in the UAE. While heading this department, they were able to significantly reduce divorce rates in the UAE. He even was concerned about prisoners' family ties and was trying to preserve them by arranging social events that brought prisoners and their families together, with the goal of strengthening their bonds. He received the Distinguished Employee Award in 2003, along with many local and regional certificates throughout the years. He always represented the Emirates to the fullest and did his best to serve his country and its people. Despite all of that, instead of honoring him, he was arrested on July 24th of 2012 by state security forces. He was arrested along with many other human rights activists, lawyers, judges, academics, counselors, even members of the elite Emirati society. A year after his arrest, my father was sentenced to 10 years in prison, followed by 3 years of probation in the unfair mass trial known as UAE 94. I still remember the night of his arrest in detail. It was the 5th of Ramadan. We were waiting for him to get home after prayers, yet he was unusually late. Around 2 a.m., about 6 men and 2 women raided our house. They had arrested my father from the street without presenting a judicial warrant and had come to inspect the house and car. As soon as they entered, they confiscated all our phones and then started their inspection. We asked them for their identity and a search warrant. We were not provided with any information regarding the identities of those who arrested him. In addition, no judicial warrant was produced or presented, nor an explanation was provided for the arrest. We asked that they at least take his medication with them, as he was suffering from severe pain due to kidney stones, and he was admitted to the hospital a few days before, but they refused. More than 10 people in civilian clothes then took my father back into the car and to an unknown location. My father was a victim of enforced disappearance. He was held in an undisclosed location and was detained incommunicado. We had no information about his whereabouts, his health, or his condition in general. 21 days after his arrest, we received a brief call from him which lasted for about 2 minutes. He was only allowed to say that he was fine and nothing else. This was the only way he communicated with us for the first 4 months. Very short and sudden calls to tell us that he was alive. He was not able to answer any of our questions about his condition. From day one, we repeatedly visited the public prosecution of state security to ask about my father and to request access to him. However, they kept denying the fact that they knew his whereabouts. On November 26 of 2012, about 4 months after his arrest, we got permission to see my father for the first time in the State Security Prosecution Office. The moment we saw him, we were shocked by his appearance. He had lost more than half of his body weight. He looked pale and in very poor health. We noticed a spot plucked from his beard, and he kept looking anxiously at the state security officer who was present the whole time during the visit, as if he had been threatened with something. Of course, we later learned during the trials and in a letter that my father wrote to the Committee Against Torture that he was subjected to various types of psychological and physical torture, threats of beating and killing, and denial of health care. For example, if he did not comply with their demands, they threatened to cut off his medication. He was exposed to continuous bright lights and the cries of torture. He also reported to the judge that they exhausted him physically and mentally before interrogations. And then at the prosecutor's office, they forced him to sign prosecution's papers without allowing him to read them, arguing that it was the end of their working hours and they need to leave. My father was deprived of most of his basic rights, such as sun exposure, exercising, newspapers, books, papers and pens, adequate, clean and warm clothing for winter, etc. He remained in a secret solitary prison for about 8 months. On March 9th of 2013, he was then transferred to the infamous Arazin prison. Although my father complained to the extension judge, who was aware that he was in solitary confinement, about the ill treatment he experienced, the prison conditions, and the torture he was subjected to, none of his statements were considered and all his complaints were ignored. He tried writing his complaints and he was denied access to papers and pens. We were visiting the Public Prosecution Office, the State Security Office, the Ministry of Interior Affairs, and many other relevant institutions almost weekly to submit our complaints about the violations against my father, but 99% of our complaints and requests were rejected and ignored. In addition, he experienced several violations during his trials. My father was initially denied access to his lawyer until shortly after the trial started. His lawyer also did not have access to the case file consisting of more than 10,000 pages until after the trial had already started. Putting 94 defendants on trial simultaneously without giving them and their defense team sufficient time to prepare arguments against the prosecution gives us the impression that the trial was fictitious. It also would seem that the judges do not have the ability to disagree with the state security's opinion about the accused. I mean, how is it possible for one lawyer to defend 77 defendants in a case of this size and complexity, especially considering he didn't receive the case file until after the trial had begun? How will a lawyer study the file of each detainee separately in such a short time? In addition, 13 trial sessions were held for 94 defendants in just 4 months. Like, that's just unbelievable. The judge never investigated my father and other detainees' testimonies regarding their enforced disappearance, the torture they endured, and all other violations of human rights they've experienced. This alone gives us more reason to believe the court was fictitious. And it is also in violation of the International Convention Against Torture, to which the UAE signed. On top of all of this, my father was sentenced to 10 years of imprisonment that was not subject to appeal, without credible and admissible evidence to prove the charges against him. Today, he has about 12 days left before the end of this arbitrary sentence. Yet it is still unknown whether he will be released or if he'll be kept indefinitely under the counseling clause, as the case of many prisoners of conscience who are still imprisoned despite their sentences ending. It does not end there. We, as a family of prisoners of conscience in the UAE, were included in this collective punishment. Our human rights, as well as our national rights, were violated. Our families were subjected to various forms of discrimination and harassment. My sister and I were denied academic scholarships and university admissions despite our qualification for it, and the reason being we were not approved by state security. In addition, with every simple transaction at any governmental entity, we were required to submit a separate request to higher authorities and endure a long process before we were granted approval to complete routine procedures such as renewing official documents, etc. Another example of the collective punishment system we were experiencing included withholding my father's pension, which was our family's only income. Furthermore, they terminated the medical grant for my 3 brothers, all 3 of whom suffer from Dravet syndrome and have medical reports that prove their critical health condition. The harshest and most shocking punishment was revoking the citizenship of not only my father, but my entire family. We were informed of this decision over the phone and given no explanation and no legal base to it. Many other families in the UAE experienced very similar things, including revocation of their citizenships without a legal basis. They are currently living in their own homelands like strangers, deprived of their rights. A perfect example that I can give, and one that is very close to me, is my sister, who's currently in the UAE. She was revoked. She was asked to hand over her passport and ID after our citizenship was revoked, but she refused, of course. Her identity was confiscated during her visit with my father at the Razim prison. She's now living in a large prison, deprived of her rights. She's banned from traveling. She cannot perform any simple transactions or receive any governmental services or apply for any job because she does not have any identity or document that proves her existence and preserves her human and national rights. These are all examples of what we experience for solely being families of prisoners of conscience in the UAE. And then we are asked to remain silent about all of these violations, and we are threatened with imprisonment if we speak up to defend our rights and the rights of prisoners of conscience, in a clear violation to all international regulations and laws that protect human rights and freedom of speech. Thank you.
We'll now hear from our last speaker, Naji Hamdan, the director of the Association of Victims of Torture in the UAE.
Listening to the colleagues attending here and the ones online, really open wounds that one can think that they will heal, but it seems they won't. Ironically, 12 years after my time, I still hear the same systematic process, whether be it the arrest process or the due process or the torture process. Yet the perpetrators are still getting away with it. That's very unfortunate. Naji Hamdan is the name, President of the Association for Victims of Torture in the UAE. We also have submitted a detailed report to the CAT committee on some, but not all the cases of torture by the UAE, whose victims we have assisted. I am one of these victims, as are each of the members of our organization. In the 4 years since we founded, cases of torture appear to be increasing in UAE, not decreasing, unfortunately. As the UN itself is aware, these have included recent damning, groundbreaking findings of torture and kidnap by UK court in the case of Princess Haya of Jordan and Princess Latifa Al Maktoum. Parallel findings by the UN as well, related judgments finding torture of European citizens Tina J. and David Hay. Today, I can briefly only talk about the torture of me in UAE. You've listened to my colleagues, and if we take each of the process of torture, it will take so much time and days to just explain how the process of torture is going on in UAE prisons. I was arrested in 2008, my hands and feet painfully cuffed, blindfolded, violently beaten, thrown into an SUV with blacked out windows, taken to a secret location, incommunicado for 89 days, in constant fear for my life and that of my family, held in a refrigerated underground cell, regularly severely beaten on the soles of my feet, what's so-called falaka, then taken to the interrogation by I could not walk for 2 weeks. To go to the interrogation room, I was taken by 2 Nepali guards. Violently beaten all over my body. UAE torturer, favorite area was to beat my liver area, stomach, and head until I passed out, which I did often. Subject to death threats against me, my wife, and my family, the UAE Secret Service torturer told me that he would kidnap my wife and rape her before my eyes. Then afterwards, sent to the notorious Al-Wathba prison, I learned that the horrors that happened to me had happened to all the others I met, and much worse. Perhaps my US citizenship and the media attention saved my life, so I can also, as Matthew, sit before you. I was lucky. Other inmates were not so lucky. It's not only physical abuse that is used as a tool of torture, but sexual abuse too. We received many complaints of horrific sexual abuse by the UAE police against male and female inmates, including a young 18-year-old UAE national whom I met myself at Al-Wathba prison, and to one of our association's member, Mr. David Hay, a lawyer and a British national, where UK judge found him was raped and tortured by Dubai police. Even today, the torture continues. We continue to regularly receive testimonies from victims and their families seeking our help and the help of the UN, such as from the family of Lebanese citizen Ahmed al-Mikawi, detained in UAE since 2014, in solitary confinement since October 2019, forbidden to contact his relatives, subjected to such horrific torture, his skull was fractured. He went through several operations in prison. His family asked me to raise his case before the CAT delegation, and I will hopefully do so tomorrow. So we sit here today. I respectfully ask you to think about the lives destroyed by the UAE. My colleagues from the respected NGOs present here and those who could not attend, along with us at the AVT UAE, implore to do our utmost to bring those UAE officials responsible to justice and bring torture to an end. I thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak before you today. Thank you very much.
I want to thank again all our speakers for sharing their experiences with us. And now we open the floor for a Q&A, both for people in the room and for those who are following us online.
So please state your name and organization before asking your question, and you can raise your hand electronically or here in the room. I don't know if there's questions here in the room. So no questions here in the room. Online, if you have questions, please raise your hand. We'll give you the floor. No questions as well. Maybe if you want to each have a concluding word before ending this press conference, I would let you, maybe Julia start, or Ali maybe. So one question. Okay, so from...
Hello, everyone. Firstly, thank you very much for the interesting talks. My name is Oscar Jens. I used to be Amnesty UK's country coordinator for the UAE and Iran these days as an independent human rights activist. So just maybe asking a kind of broad question for the panel in terms of what do you find to be the most effective kind of recourse for justice, or even getting these things in the media? Because what I found over the course of 4.5 years, it's very hard to get public attention. The most attention I've seen are cases of litigation or targeting high-profile institutions such as Interpol, for example, where there is evidence of individuals who are involved in torture or ill treatment. But when it comes to public campaigning, there's been quite a lot of trouble simply due to a lack of media interest. So maybe broadly speaking to the panel, what do you think kind of would be the most effective way forward in terms of raising these issues and raising these voices and making sure that these things are heard and the UAE officials are held accountable in some way?
Oscar, thank you very much for the question. I would be afraid to say that it's seriously possible to go and get some form of accountability immediately. Instead, I would suggest, or I would think that from experience, it's about keeping the name in an elevated position. So we've seen a great degree of whitewashing that's occurred, especially say in the UK with sports teams, with marketing of great campaigns, you know, and airlines, and anything else around this area. That there's still a very positive connotation, even with Saudi Arabia, around the world in certain areas, as opposed to maybe a more accurate description of what happens in these countries. But what they don't like is that negative press. It's, we say, by comparing Saudi Arabia and the UAE, Saudi Arabia is going to be nearly, it's nearly impossible for the country to be able to be seen in a positive light nearly anywhere in the world. But the UAE has still been able to quite expertly demonstrate and show it is on the same side as many countries in different areas. It legitimizes its operations in Yemen and other states through counterterrorism operations. It funds sports teams, and it shows it's part of a greater, wider community. But if its negative perception, if its engagements in negative activities continues to be part of like predominant headlines, this is something which they don't like, and they end up having to slowly retract their position. And I think, you know, its involvement, as Naji said, with the abuses that were proven in court by the ruler of Dubai, Mohammed bin Rashid, by the hacking that the UAE has directed, this has really set them back internationally and their reputation. I think that's really going to be the way forward for some form of attitude change as opposed to sanction. That's going to be quite a difficult step to achieve.
Yeah, I think Matthew already gave a pretty good overview. I just wanted to say that at MENA Rights Group, we document cases of human rights violations, and we try to engage with the UN human rights mechanisms to try and get some positive change. And we hope that the review of the UAE by the UN Committee Against Torture will be one of those opportunities to bring some positive change. So we'll follow that closely, and hopefully this will lead to some improvement. We've made several recommendations for the committee. We'll see how that plays out during the review.
We have one more question from Zoom. No more question. So maybe if you want to have some concluding remarks before ending this press conference, you can each say a few words. What are you expecting from the UN Committee on Torture, Against Torture, and what will be the next step?
What we expecting from NGO, especially because they have authority to bring, especially human rights violation, and when they review UAE cases against human rights, they have authority, they have a power, maybe. For them, its reputation is very important, but for us, our rights and our, especially people still in prison, they don't have any access for lawyers, anything, many people, I assume. So I hope so, NGO look firmly and UAE review for human rights violation. Thank you.
I would really emphasize going forward the need for transparency, and the need for transparency both at the UN, both by the UAE, but also by states that have a presence there. When Naji and myself, I've known of foreign nationals being held in those countries. That means, to a large degree, those states know what happens to their citizens in those institutions. This is not something that is restricted to one or another. It occurs and it's well known. This has to be calling a kettle black. It's the idea that you have to call it what it is. This does occur. It has to be acknowledged and recognized. This then goes down to the rules and regulations. When we speak about the state security legislation, how it works, why it works, what about the impartiality of the judges, the inability to secure legal representation, the fact that lawyers who have represented cases in state security courts have themselves been, imprisoned. Again, emphasizing this, illustrating it. So with all of this collective evidence out there, there is that wider acknowledgement and there is sanction for this, as well as the fact that it's trying to secure the release of those persons who are imprisoned wrongly, to make sure that their health and human rights are looked after. You don't want to say a reset, but you want to try and help people that are in that situation now and to prevent others from being there in the future. There's kind of a dual-pronged approach there. But that's what you would hope for, but it's obviously a little bit more difficult than that.
Although we're running on a very tight budget as small NGOs like ourselves, however, keep exposing the ill treatment of UAE is one good way of in getting some results in the end. How long would it take? I would assume it will take a long time, but in the end, we will prevail. Okay? Thank you.
I'd just like to thank once again all of our speakers for sharing their experiences with us. And yes, as I said, we'll follow this review closely. As it's the first one, it's hard to predict what we'll be hearing from the state because it's the first time they go through this procedure. But the review will be public online for anyone who is interested, and we'll be following up as well. So if you want to follow our website or social media to keep posted on that. Thanks again, but we have one more question.
One last question. So Emma, you have the floor.
Thanks very much. It's Emma Farge from Reuters in Geneva. Thanks for the testimonies, Matthew and Ali. I was wondering, I know you're going to be testifying before the UN committee this week. I was just wondering how many such testimonies are actually going to be brought before the committee this week, and would that be like the first time ever that so many have come out in public? And would there, maybe some of the NGOs could help me? I'd be interested in the scale of how many people you think have been tortured in in the UAE in detention? Thanks a lot.
Answer in the microphone.
There were, if I'm not mistaken, there were 10 alternative reports that were sent to the committee, and so Matthew and Ali will be able to present their testimonies to the committee. This is not a super standard procedure. Usually NGOs are the ones that are briefing the committee based on the cases that NGOs document, but it's not the most usual for victims themselves to present. I can't say if this is the first time this happened. We don't have enough knowledge to say that, but I can say that this is unusual. As for the numbers of cases, it's really hard to tell because there are only so many cases that become public. As we heard today from Janan, sometimes there are consequences for families there are not only consequences for the people who speak out, but there are consequences for the family. So it's normal that a lot of people in fear of reprisals will not speak about their cases. So unfortunately, we can only talk about the cases we document. That is probably a very small percentage of the total number. I don't know if... Yeah.
Emma, this is when I said it, and I think, Naji, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but when I said that we were extremely lucky to be here, we both mean it on a day-to-day basis, but also to be able to speak up as survivors. You know, as Janan was saying about her family, if your own state abandons you, you know, what support do you have? What can they do? There is nowhere for them to turn. If Ali and myself are here, we have that legal support to be able to do this. I have my wife is here, you know, for that like emotional support, going through the counseling and therapy to be able to deal with these types of settings, let alone then verbally presenting evidence at the UN. This is not a small thing, but from the scale of our individual, you know, collective responses, there's an extremely high proportion in the normal jail, in the normal prison conditions. But if someone then goes through the state security network, you would say with an extremely high probability that they suffered certainly abuse, if not torture. This would be extremely high because of the complete lack of oversight and protections for those victims.
Mr. Naji, you want to add something?
I would just like to say that maybe we're not many tomorrow at the delegation. By the way, each NGO will have 2.5 minutes to speak, so that's not much time to talk. But the delegation, the CAD delegation, already has the reports. So that's the main important thing. And what we're going to say is a little pinch for this big state, and hopefully, pinch after pinch will do something.
I don't know if there are any more questions, but I think this is it from our side.
So thank you very much. Thank you, Julia. Thank you to all the speakers who presented their case for the testimony. I'd like to thank also MENA Rights Group for organizing this press conference, and I would like to thank you all for participating. Thank you very much. Have a nice afternoon. Goodbye.